Alright, welcome. Today I'm going to be going over how I paint arms and hands. So I'm going to be using oil paints. The oil paints I'm using are alizarin crimson, cadmium red, yellow ochre, burnt umber, ivory black, and a little bit of titanium white. Actually a lot of titanium white. So as you can see, I'm blocking in the left arm there with kind of a generic flesh tone. This is the first day of painting. So you have to understand that you want to be a little more rough, you want to be general, you kind of want to block in the overall colors that are used in that area. And you can throw details in, but as you progress into the next few days of painting, you're going to refine it. And you will see that throughout the video. So I've blocked in a bit of the value on the inside of the elbow and the edge of the arm. And I'm not just putting an outline there because, you know, that's a stylistic choice, but actually because the value is so dark there on the edge of the elbow that looks like a dark outline. And your arms are kind of like tubes if you're to geometrically look at them. The highest points are going to have highlights, while the edges are going to get darker and rounder, and therefore less light is going to hit them, and they will have darker shadows and values. So I'm continuing to block in the arms, and you can see I'm actually wiping some of the paint away. I felt that I got a little too dark with the pigmentation of that side of the arm, and I'm adding a lot more titanium white. And titanium white's relatively opaque. It's a thicker paint, but I felt that, on the first day of painting, even too much titanium white would kind of throw off the balance of how I'm grading the value changes in the arms. So nothing wrong with taking a little paper towel, wiping away some of the oil paint. It can be forgiving in that way, and applying some more paint. And you can see I used some of the earthy tones there, a little bit of burnt umber to add more of the roundness to the edge of the arm there. Something to also keep in mind about painting skin is, it's not like it's all just the same color. There's a lot going on. You have blood vessels and freckles and different changes in the tones of how the skin is, especially the way that light hits it in different ways. So you have to keep in mind that, you painted one color to start, but as you work through it, it's going to have different bits of color here and there. Because, skin's something natural, like a tree. Not every piece of bark is the same. Sure, if you want to be cartoony, by all means, or pop art styled, you can kind of paint it one color, but you have to keep in mind that there's going to be gradation changes and color changes and shifts and value changes that really makes the skin look more realistic. So the paints I'm using are by Winsor & Newton. I really like them. You can use them at any level if you're more of an advanced, experienced oil painter, or if you're a beginner. The paints are really easy to use. They're pretty true to as they're mixed, and I love using them straight out of the tube and then mixing them on my palette. I'm not sponsored by Winsor & Newton. If somebody at their marketing team hears this and wants to give me a sponsorship, I'm all for it. But yeah, now as you can see, I'm beginning to block in the hands. This time I'm using a bit of a more brown flesh tone. As you can see, there's a bit more burnt umber in there than some of the reds. And that's just because that's what the hand looked like from my reference image. Something that's important to note about a reference image is you should take as many as you can of your model, or if it's of a landscape, of that scene, or of a still life if you don't want to paint straight from life, but use a reference photo. Maybe you're not going to be painting where it's set up, or you can only set up the still life for a small period of time. But if you're using a reference image, make sure to take lots and lots of photos. So as you can see, I've blocked in a lot of the right hand there, and the fingertips are a little more red, and that's because a lot of blood vessels run to the fingertips, and so they're going to be a little more pink, a little more red, depending on the model or how the reference photo looks. And you can see I'm always going back and painting the spots that I've painted, looking to my reference photo and seeing, oh, there's a little more of a highlight over here, I got to work on that. Oh, the value is a little softer or sharper in this region, so I need to paint that way. And as you can see, now I'm going to block in the left hand, which is on the right side, I guess, because the model is reversed. And you can see that I'm kind of doing these darker tones on the fingers again, and making sure just to kind of block it in with a general medium tone that I can then work from, adding dark and lights to. It might be hard to tell, but the fingers are actually a little bent away from the viewer, while the backside of the hand is a little closer and higher up, therefore it's lighter, and we're getting more of a light tone from it. As you can see, there's darker tones and shadows at the very edges of the fingers because they're hitting each other and no light can really go in between there. So yet again, I'm not really adding those lines just as a way of outlining the fingers, but more of a way to show that there is a value change and no light is getting in between those fingers. Now I'm kind of adding some tones that go under the watch that exists on the model's wrist, and I'm blocking in some of the knuckles, initially much darker just so I can place them right, and then slowly I'm going to go in and refine them. And this will pretty much take us close to the end of day 1 of painting. So here we are at the beginning of day 2. I'm beginning to slowly refine things here. Obviously, the further we get along in the painting, the more days progress, the more things will begin to be refined and finalized. So day 2 out of 3 days here is kind of a good way to bridge the gap between that finishing stage and that really rough stage where we're just trying to block things in. So we're trying to approximate more of the detail here, get some of the highlights and some of the colors to where they really need to belong, and get them in place, so then when we're ready to really get this painting in its finishing stage, it'll be ready to get there. Something I also think that is worth mentioning is the fact that this is my style of painting, in that this is not the right way or wrong way to paint, this is just how I do it. If you find that this tutorial ends up benefiting you, then that's fantastic, that's what I sought out to do. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong if you paint differently than me, or have a pop art style or a cartoony style or whatever it is. This is just how I go about it, and this is how I figured I would demonstrate how I do it. By all means, I love seeing all different styles of art. The best way to kind of develop your own style and advance as a painter or artist of any kind is to look to other artists, old and new, famous and less well known. So as I mentioned earlier, this is where a lot of that minimal refining begins. As you can see, I'm adding more of the colors and tones and value shifts to the tips of the fingers, and making sure that the fingernails and the shapes of them, and the shapes of the tips of the fingers and how the thumb looks are right. I had a bit of trouble with the shape of the thumb. I kept making it a little too wide and then a little too stubby. And throughout this painting, up until the very end of it, I'm making sure that I get that shape right. Because if something looks a little off and everything else looks right, it's especially more noticeable when it looks a little off. So yeah, now I'm going to come in and lighten places up and make sure that highlights exist where they're supposed to be, and a lot of places that might be a little too dark are lightened, and a lot of places that aren't dark enough are darkened, so I have those proper shadows. You can look at that left pinky, it's to the right of the painting because it's flipped. That's very dark, and I will eventually go ahead and lighten it to make sure that it is the right value and colors. Painting hands can be pretty tricky. You have to make sure that everything is in the right place and things don't look off, as I mentioned earlier. You really have to make sure the fingernails are the right shape. You have to make sure the knuckles are properly rendered, and knuckles can be pretty hard. My model here for my reference has softer features, softer tones, so the knuckles aren't as wrinkled as you might see on a hardier hand of someone who works a lot with their hands. So you have to still show that they exist as I'm doing. I'm kind of touching in, and eventually I'll go and lighten them. But at the same time, the model's knuckles are soft, so you have to make sure that they're refined and they don't stand out too much, yet still in the right place. So as you can see, I'm beginning to render in the watch here. It's a Fitbit. I'm also not sponsored by them either, so if Fitbit wants to sponsor me, I guess I'm really using this joke up a lot today. But I'm not going to stylistically render it all too much. I'm just trying to block it in, make it look like what it is. And I'm not using a completely darkened black. It's mix of Viridian green and French ultramarine blue, with actually a little bit of that crimson in there, and that's just so it's not a straight complete black. If you add too much black to something, it'll really draw your attention, almost kind of like a black hole in the middle of the painting. So you want to have lighter tones, and also nothing's really true black anyway. There's value shifts. Now I'm kind of doing some of the details on the screen and adding the highlights to show that light is reflecting off the shiny glass, And then I'm doing that kind of metal looking plastic on the edge there. I'm going to render in the button just easily, and then add a little bit of value under the watch to show that it's sitting above the skin and creating a shadow right there. So as I continue to work throughout the finishing stages of day 2, I'm going to make sure that everything is in a good place where I want to leave it for day 3. The painting isn't there yet. It looks okay, it doesn't look fantastic. We know this because, we're going to work on it some more. We're going to get into that refining stage. And sometimes you're going to have to let the painting sit a little while. That's why it's good to work in various days and not do it all at once. Because oil paints, are a bit translucent. Sometimes the light will travel through them. And if you layer and build those colors, there's a nice effect that allows the value changes and color shifts to really pop. So we're going to make sure we do that. So I'm going to kind of touch on the last details that I want to do for day 2 and get it to a place where I'm ready to leave it before I pick it up again on day 3, which will be our finishing day. So here we are at the beginning of day 3, which is the final day. We're going to make sure that everything looks the way it needs to be. The paint has dried a lot. I waited a few days in between this session to make sure that I'm kind of doing wet on dry. So some places I'll put on a lot of paint to make sure that it kind of sits above all of the underlayers. While on other spots I'll add very small amounts of paint to the tip of the brush and carefully add it, kind of mimicking that dry texture of the canvas and dried paint. So what we've done essentially is start by being very broad with the placement of our color, value, and detail, and slowly funnel that into a very precise placement of where highlights and values go, as well as where color shifts are and where shadows go. So as you can see now, I'm really going in and precisely placing in the space between the fingers and that dark line of value that shows that there's depth between them, but they're pressed up against each other. So they look more three-dimensional. They're round. They're not just, thin, rounded rectangles, but, tubes at the end of a hand, essentially, which is what fingers are, of course. You can see I'm doing the crease of the thumb and the pointer finger, and making sure that a lot of the nails look like fingernails and are the right shape. They don't just look like domes at the end of the finger. Now I'm adding small highlights where they need to go on the fingernails, the edges of the fingers, making sure that the light plays in the right places of the finger. And that's what a lot of the third day really is. It's just small little details, making sure colors are in the right places, shadows are in the right places, making sure that everything looks rendered properly. We've done most of the heavy lifting in the 2 days prior. This is the fun work where you really just have to figure out when to stop. So while I was finishing up on the hands, I wanted to make sure I could go back to the rest of the arms and do the inside crease of where the elbow is and where it bends, and make sure that it's properly darkened. At first I went in and made some of that shadow a little too dark, so we just add a little bit of white. We go in, glaze over that carefully, and make sure that it's properly put in and doesn't look too dark, doesn't look too light, but looks like, there's value there. And we're going in again, adding the final highlights to the arms, making sure that they look properly rendered. You may have noticed that I've begun to also lay in some of the freckles and the moles on the arms. These are just the last little final touches that are fun to add. make sure that the skin really looks like it's skin and gives it a more realistic appearance. It's the final little details that can really make a painting. You can see that I'm slowly going back and working the arms, touching on all the different places of the arms and the hands, making sure that I like where details are placed. And I'm slowly going to go back and eventually render some of the shadows that are under the watch and finalize them as well. So as you can see, I didn't really like how I had some of the edges of the wristband of the watch there. So I went in and just carefully refined them without tampering too much with how the rest of it was painted. And I'm making sure just to make all of those little details look right in order to make sure that they're finished, so I don't have to go back and fix them again. Another thing worth mentioning is that these arms and hands are part of a greater figure painting that's still underway. As you can see, part of the background has been blocked in, and that's kind of with a watered down painting using solvents. And you don't want to overpaint what you're doing. So these hands, I'm making sure I'm going to get them to a good place where I can stop and then work on, the pants and the shirt. And you don't want them to be so overpainted that they subtract from the other details of the painting. You want them to fit in just right, stylistically, with the rest of the painting. And with the final details finally being put in place, I felt that this was a good time for me to put my brush down and walk away and start to work on other things. But you can always go back and touch up things that you've missed or whatnot. The painting isn't done until you, the artist, think it's done. And so here it is, the finished arms and hands. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial as much as I enjoyed painting it and learned a little something new. And feel free to like and subscribe so I can do these videos more often. This was my first video, and I hope to do many more. So thank you guys.